So Owen Jones, once again, has produced a video last week which deals with the Israel Palestine conflict. And like most of his videos, there seems to be a slight a bit of a slant or a limitation and a bit of confusion as to how he deals with the subject matter. And in this video, we'd like to both actually shed some agreement, and I think that should be stressed. We do agree on certain points of his analysis of the Israel-Palestine situation. However, I think there's a lot to be disagreed with as well as to how he deals with the situation and with the facts and with the history, which he seems to be quite ignorant of, or kind of purposefully so, if indeed he isn't ignorant of the facts. And also comment a bit on the dimension that Donald Trump is going to add to the situation, and just, as I said, both agree but also provide what I think is an important critique.
Why isn't the British government taking a stand on the Israeli government's violation of international law, its continued expansion of settlements, its brutal occupation of the Palestinian people?
I think it's important to say that I'm almost in what I would call kind of violent agreement with Owen Jones, that finally, that it's a good thing that finally both the United States of America and the Obama administration, rather belatedly, but better late than never, has actually decided to try and sanction the Israeli government for its further building and continued building of settlements in the West Bank, and that it's not an unreasonable demand that we should have some kind of agreement or support coming from 10 Downing Street, and that Theresa May should similarly kind of join this pressure, limited as it is, on the Israelis to stop building more settlements in the West Bank. I agree with Owen Jones and with pretty much the majority of the consensus in the international community that these settlements are illegal, they are counterproductive to the peace process, and that essentially they are immoral in the most kind of fundamental of sense, in that the Israelis, supposedly the Israeli government says it's building settlements for its own defence. However, there seems to be a bit of an absurd logic in play, because how possibly can putting civilians and civilian settlers into what is a conflict zone or a war zone serve the aims of peace? And I must, as I've said, agree with Owen Jones that Theresa May has been very lacklustre on this and has actually seemingly distanced herself from Barack Obama and wants to fall in line with Donald Trump on this issue. And I don't think it is unreasonable, as Owen Jones suggests, that we should be a bit disappointed or that we should complain that Theresa May hasn't been a bit more heroic on this issue or a bit more principled and moral about this. However, I must say, actually, it's not surprised me at all. I don't think Theresa May is or will ever be that capable of kind of surprising us or taking any kind of heroic or moral stands in the area of foreign policy.
So I think we all have a responsibility as citizens to put pressure on our government, whether it be Israel, whether it be the Saudis, states and governments and regimes which are acting partly in our name, in which, you know, their behaviour is something that we are responsible, partly we're complicit in as countries.
I think it's important to say that Owen Jones is mistaken to dedicate about 90% of his video to talking both about the Americans and the government of the United Kingdom as if they are the vital or main determinants of this conflict and situation. That if you could only sort out the Americans and the European allies, then you could quite easily sort out the whole of the conflict in the Middle East, and we're the only things that are kind of standing in the way or obstructing a very rapid and easy to find peace solution to the conflict.
Viable state. Now, I know what's going to happen now. People are going to go, hold on a minute, Owen, what about Hamas? Obviously, I condemn Hamas and their actions. Sometimes you get this thing called whataboutery. What it means basically is, look over there. Why aren't you condemning all these other things in the world?
Owen Jones does spend all of about 10 seconds acknowledging that Hamas do pose a small difficulty to the achievement of peace. However, he, as I say, does just that. He spends about 10 seconds acknowledging that they exist, but then doesn't suggest any solutions to or how you might go about getting these people, i.e. a Islamist group that runs an authoritarian government in the Gaza Strip, to sit around the negotiating and peace table with the Israelis when their founding charter is based on the idea that Israel is a kind of a great Satan, a demonic nation that needs to be wiped from the face of the earth, and that all of the Jewish people need to be annihilated and massacred. How do you get a group of fundamentalists like this to agree with the Israelis that there should be some kind of common sharing of the land, when actually the Hamas and their Islamist ideologues are completely and utterly kind of anathema to this kind of solution, or this kind of peaceful working out of the problem? Secondly, there's another obstruction which he doesn't talk about whatsoever, or doesn't even acknowledge, not even for 10 seconds, and that is the existence of the Palestinian Authority, its domination by PLO or Fatah, and there seems to be a great historical ignorance on the part of Owen Jones not to mention this, because throughout the 1990s and before, and into the 2000s as well, the government of the Palestinian Authority, the government of the Palestinians in the West Bank, has continually rejected and completely opposed any of the multiple peace solutions that have been put forward, the most important of which was at Camp David in the late 1990s, when Yasser Arafat refused and said no to a solution that did cover most of the important points under contention. The peace solutions that was put forward by Bill Clinton and that was agreed to by the Israeli government of the time was going to share the capital of Jerusalem between the two nations. It was going to arrange for mutual land swaps between the Israelis and the Palestinians to make up for what settlements would be left in the West Bank. Most of the issues were quite reasonably covered in that peace agreement, and it was rejected by Yasser Arafat, just as other peace agreements have also been rejected by the Palestinian Authority. So I think this is where the great confusion lies in the perspective that Owen Jones takes. Yes, he's right about the Americans and ourselves, that we should oppose and perhaps do a tiny bit more to sanction the Israelis on these issues. But the idea that this is simply what needs to happen and that will have a decisive impact on the Middle East conflict is really to show how little of the detail and of the history of this issue that Owen Jones actually seems to know, or at least acknowledge.
It will be President-elect Donald Trump issuing slightly wacky statements via Twitter. And he said, "We cannot continue to let Israel be treated with such disdain and disrespect. Stay strong, Israel. January the 20th is fast approaching."
So it certainly seems, and once again I agree with Owen Jones, that the presidency of Donald Trump is going to be pretty much business as usual as far as the American approach to the Israel-Palestine situation is concerned. It's probably going to be something close to unconditional support for the Israelis in most of the things that they do, whether that's building new settlements in the West Bank, or whether that's bombarding the Gaza or committing other such kind of violations of international law. However, I think once again he's wrong in the stance that he takes, or what's implicit in what he says in his attitude, which is that somehow if Donald Trump was, for example, to try and pose uncharacteristically as a dove instead of a hawk, if he tried to be the peacemaker in all of this, then what significantly has changed, or what kind of promise is there that Donald Trump would succeed where somebody like Bill Clinton continually failed in the late 1990s to try and get a peace agreement between the PA or Hamas and the Israeli government? Owen Jones doesn't seem to provide any fresh perspective on this, or any positive kind of reason to believe that things would be different. And ultimately, my main question to Owen Jones would be, as I've said, why will Donald Trump be able to do as president what Bill Clinton and others before him, even George Bush, failed to do in the 2000s as well?
So he said about J Street, which is an organisation, a very commendable, courageous organisation of American Jews for justice in the United States. He said of them, are J Street supporters really as bad as capos? The answer actually is no. They are far worse than capos. Jews who turned in their fellow Jews in the death camps. The capos faced extraordinary cruelty, and who knows what any of us would have done under those circumstances to save a loved one. But J Street, they are just smug advocates of Israel's destruction delivered from the comfort of their secure American sofas. It's hard to imagine anyone worse.
So I would agree that the remarks of David Freeman regarding the anti-Israeli or pro-Palestinian Jewish groups in America and comparing them to, or on moral terms, to the capos of the Holocaust who worked in the concentration camps is a really horribly confusing and distasteful and completely unnecessary and is kind of a set of remarks which are really not and shouldn't be the behaviour of the respective diplomat of the United States of America. However, I think actually it's worth saying that Owen Jones, having bulldozed into this really, as I've said, confusing and distasteful and kind of bizarre and peculiar exchange of words as he has, is worth perhaps commenting upon, because I think he's actually perhaps missed the logic and the point of the argument being made, as distasteful as it otherwise might be. And I think he's overcooking it a bit. With respect to Freeman said that the anti-Israeli groups are worse than the capos. Now, what he said to try and justify that is that the capos should be seen as being victims of the Holocaust and should be seen as morally neutral. And there is actually, I don't know if Owen Jones is aware, it wouldn't surprise me if he's not, that there is actually quite a history to this debate as to trying to justify or render the role of the capos as being that of being kind of morally neutral or, as said, being victims of the Holocaust. The most prominent voice in all of this was that of Primo Levi, who was one of the great writers who came out of the death camps. He was I believe he was a chemist at Auschwitz, Jewish prisoner there who managed to survive the war and the conflict and managed to get out and was rescued. And in several of his books, in particular The Drowned and the Saved, he does actually, from a first-hand perspective, provide a quite convincing argument and case for what I've said is the idea that the capos weren't actually as these abominable characters that others have thought that they were. And if indeed that is the case, then actually the point that David Freeman's making, it very much is a tortured point, and that should be stressed. However, it really isn't quite as abominable and as flagrantly kind of disgusting as Owen Jones is perhaps making out that it is. But once again, this is something that requires a bit of research, a bit of knowledge, and that seems to be something that Owen Jones isn't always that keen on. So in conclusion, I'd like to stress again, there are a lot of points of agreement that I share with Owen Jones with regards to the immorality and the illegality of building settlements in the West Bank. And another point that I'd like to make and I'd like to stress is that, which I'm with kind of agreement with Owen Jones on and with disagreement or in disagreement with a lot of his critics, is that I don't believe there is anything that you could legitimately call anti-Semitic about the points that Owen Jones has made. However, that is a slur which is completely incorrectly applied to people like Owen Jones, who are making, as I've said, these are criticisms of Israel which are slightly one-sided and slanted and distorted. That as it might be, I don't think this is a case of anti-Semitism, and I think it's completely incorrect and a misuse of the term and a kind of a point against or an obstruction to the fight against anti-Semitism to label people like Owen Jones anti-Semites. However, as I've said, the points of disagreement are that this is a one-sided video. It's a video that goes after a very easy target as far as kind of boiling down the Middle East peace process to be a cause simply of the Americans and the United Kingdom and Donald Trump and a lot of kind of these other kind of bogeymen. And actually, there needs to be a tiny bit more of a knowledge and investigation of the history of the conflict, a bit more of a knowledge of what the PA are all about, a bit more of a knowledge of what Hamas are all about. And only once we get that bit of understanding together can we actually make kind of proper and relevant and important kind of comments or critiques on foreign policy and our particular leaders and the way they conduct it.